I'm a terrible gamer. You will never see my gameplay because I don't even want to see it sometimes. But just like movies, I enjoy analyzing the story of the games that I do play. I'm Micah, licensed therapist, and here we like to talk about horror and mental health. I finally played all the way through this game recently so that I could properly begin the second one, which recently came out. Senua is a fascinating character living in a fantasy world that's based on Norse and Celtic mythology. So this first part of the saga, we see Senua venturing into the underworld, or Helheim. She's going to try to retrieve the soul of her love who was murdered, and is being held by the goddess Hela. This game is a mixture of puzzle solving, psychological horror, and melee combat. What is unique is the way that they choose to represent psychosis in this story. Psychosis is a combination of symptoms that impact the mind and its connection with reality. If someone is in psychosis, their perceptions are skewed, and this tends to challenge their ability to determine what's real and what isn't. Psychosis can be caused by many things, but it can also be just a single unexplained episode. It is more common amongst specific disorders, talking about schizophrenia spectrum disorders, bipolar spectrum disorders, severe depression, drugs, and alcohol. Of course, this part of the story caught my attention. Had to play it. I think the coolest part of the story is how they chose to represent mental illness. They used the advisement of not only professionals working in the field, but also people who had experienced it for themselves. Professor Paul Fletcher, a neuroscientist and psychosis expert, stated that it's been refreshing to see a representation of psychosis in which the person isn't just a sort of passive receptacle for madness. Senua is a hero of her own story, trying to make sense of her experiences and work her way through them. It's incredibly destigmatizing. In representations of mental illness on screen, you usually have the illness first, then the two-dimensional character attached to that. In this case, the character is fully formed, and they are not defined by this condition. I agree. I think that is how they represented Senua in this story. So who is Senua? She is a Pict warrior. Based on the Pict people, they're based out of what is known now as modern-day Scotland. And Senua has what she considers a curse. She hallucinates, which we find out later is something that her mother experienced as well. Her mother chose to frame it as a gift, considering it the ability to see things that other people couldn't. And Senua's mother was known as a healer. Throughout most of the story, Senua believes that her mother took her own life due to the darkness, which is the curse. But Senua blocked out some stuff. That was incorrect. She refers to the voices that she hears as the Furies. So Senua is followed by the curse that she calls the darkness. When she ventures into Helheim to find her lover's soul, Dillion, she has to go up against multiple gods prior to getting to Hela. So on Senua's journey, she is accompanied by the spirit of Druth, a former slave of the Northmen, who she met while she isolated herself from others. We'll get into that. And he helps her for a while in the story. Look at the Furies for a second. So the Furies are always whispering, encouraging, criticizing. It is a sensory nightmare. You're hearing little voices back and forth in your head while you're playing the game, especially if you wear headphones. This is a fair depiction of the experience of psychosis. So Senua has auditory and visual hallucinations, and I would even argue tactile, since she seems to feel and touch things that aren't quite there. Senua carries her love's head because it's the seat of the soul, and she believes this is the key to getting Dillion back. She kind of has it strapped to her side over here, and it's just like there, and I could not stop thinking about how gross that probably smells. Alright, so what is the darkness? I think that the darkness is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I think this is from abuse. Senua's father was stupid religious, and I would not be surprised if he had his own touch of religious psychosis. He didn't think Galena, Senua's mother, was gifted. He decided that she was cursed and needed to be burned alive. This happened when Senua was 5 years old, and yeah, she saw it happen. The trauma of this then exacerbated her own psychosis and also blocked out some of the memories, which is a trauma response sometimes. Senua's father then convinced her that she was cursed with the evil darkness. He continued to physically and emotionally abuse her until she met Dillion. Dillion did not see Senua as cursed, and the two quickly fell in love. So she decides, I'm out with this dude, and leaves her father's house. Returns to Dillion's village. Dillion actually helps her develop her inner warrior that he could see that other people were not able to. Then there's this plague that kills a lot of people in Dillion's village. And because trauma, Senua's, it's my fault. I brought it here with the darkness. She decides that she has to remove herself from the situation, be away from everyone until she can conquer this curse. So she goes out in full isolation out into the wilderness to battle her darkness. This is similar to how people behave when they're in a mental health crisis, especially of the depressive kind. Isolate themselves because they don't want to be a burden to others. Don't do that. After a year of fighting her curse, she returns to find that Dillion has been murdered by the Northmen as a sacrifice to their gods. She is determined to save his soul from the Northmen, so off to hell she goes. So let's talk briefly about how they integrate Psychosis into the story. So the creators of the game intended for there to be a mental health element and wanted the story to primarily take place in Senua's mind. That kind of thing's been done before, so I'm glad they switched it up a little. Developers quickly learned in their research that it was not just the symptoms of the illness that were the biggest challenge. It's often the stigma and the response that people receive from society that is the biggest challenge when they're dealing with psychosis. The other unique theme is that these hallucinations are not always scary and negative, and the creators of this game really wanted to reflect that. According to Michael Briers of PlayStation Lifestyle, by working closely with neuroscientists and those unfortunate few who have been diagnosed as psychotic, person with psychosis. Person first language, if at all possible. Hellblade carefully avoids those cheap half-assed tropes that render a character insane and therefore woefully one-dimensional. Not only does it act as a disservice to those who suffer from mental illness, this practice of painting in broad strokes only minimizes the room for nuance, but Senua's sacrifice boldly cuts through the white noise. This game is even credited by one mother for saving her son's life. He sought help after playing through the game and actually felt motivated and inspired to keep going rather than to take his own life as he had planned. I think that's neat. Now, I do want to say that not everyone is on board with this depiction, and I get it. I definitely see their point. Critics express concern that this representation might not paint the full picture. Caregivers who are often involved in real-life situations when people have mental illness with psychosis were not depicted, and they could have been. That's one of the criticisms. In addition, some critics thought that it was not favorable to depict illness as something as an asset. And even one said that it shouldn't be depicted as an asset or a helpful superpower that can give you strength to soldier through on the darkness so long as you can put up with the odd breakdown here and there. I would argue that this story does not simply show an odd breakdown here or there. I think it's shown in a way that really emphasizes the pain and the struggle and how many times she considered accepting defeat. But what do I know? I mean, they are using this metaphorical and fictional story to tell this tale. The game would probably be weirder if she had a caregiver following her around, reminding her to take her medicine and go to therapy. Doesn't really go with the theme. And actually, if you want to get technical, Druth and Dillion's spirit and half of the Furies kind of are caregiver-esque through this journey. I do want to say I have not experienced psychosis personally, but I have worked with a number of people who have. I can't speak for them. We do need to listen to people who are depicted in these narratives, which is why the developers included people who had first-hand experience because they lived it. It doesn't mean everyone agrees though, and that's okay. Now, as someone with mental illness without psychosis and a neurodevelopmental disorder, I think I can speak to this depiction from a more generalized standpoint. So the voices that Senua hears felt familiar to rapid-fire thoughts that someone may experience with ADHD or maybe a manic or hypomanic episode that you see in bipolar disorder. The battle between self-doubt and encouragement would be exhausting, and that's what it feels like sometimes. So Senua's ability to see things from different perspectives, in some part literally through the lens of a different reality, was powerful to me. If you know depression and recovery from depression, you know this feeling. You can't see a way out, not until your perspective and entire paradigm shift, which I think is represented especially in one portion of the game when Senua has to look through the giant mask and see the different perspectives to make her way through the environment that she's in. And I find it interesting that throughout that, she has to go back and forth to these masks and look through them, and one isn't good and one isn't bad, one is light and one is dark, but both serve their purpose, and both perspectives allow her to get through this portion of the game. The cutscenes that you can't skip really drag you through Senua's experience. It's raw and visceral and familiar if you've ever been to these depths yourself. There are two schools of thought that I've identified when it comes to the next theme, and I personally think that they can both be valid and and coexisting. Disabling as mental illness can be, it does serve some people. And some people, myself included, feel a sense of control over my ailments because I am able to see the benefit, making lemonade from the lemons. I absolutely do not want to minimize the opposing school of thought because I experience it too. This is disabling for many, and despite all the good things that can come from a brain that works a little bit differently, deep down, most people would rather not deal with it. That's life. You gotta deal with shit you don't want to. You gotta make the most of it. This brings me to the reality of mental illness. You have to manage your mental health. It's not something you can just fix entirely, in my opinion. We are imprinted by our experiences, and while we can manage and decrease the distress, we can't erase what has been done and however it got there. We can choose to address it and to change how we respond to it and our own behavior. So the abuse aspect is essential to examine. Senua's got crazy complex trauma. This is very much a weight or darkness that people carry with them. Senua, through this story, goes through the process of having re-emerging memories and begins to see her experience from a broader view. She learns that she was not the problem, that she had something going on that she needed support and needed to learn to manage it as her mother had. Because of the abusive behavior of her father, she came to see it as a curse and something inherently wrong. But then the truth emerges. Her father made the curse. He traumatized Senua and tore her down to the state that she was in when she left. Not only does she have a card dealt to her in life that she has to deal with, but it was exacerbated by her shitty dad, trying to pray the darkness away. This may feel familiar to those who have experience with abusive caregivers, being exclusively at fault and blamed for your shortcomings, no matter how and who helped develop them. Senua gets to hear her father's voice in her head sometimes, and the Furies seem to reflect his belief on occasion. What our caregivers say to us often turn into our internal dialogue, much like we see represented with the Furies for Senua. We try to use these to manage ourselves, but it backfires. Turns out being hard on yourself isn't super helpful sometimes. We're going to talk about the rot. So this is a tricky little trick that stirs up some distress in the player while they are playing the game. As I said, I'm an awful gamer and I die a lot. In Hellblade, you are introduced to the idea that each time you die, the rot consuming Senua continues to grow, making its way up her arm. You're told that if it reaches her head, it explicitly states all progress will be lost if this happens. So it feels like a metaphor for deep depression, possibly even suicidal depression. It just grows and grows until it gets to your head. But the game creators are friggin' liars. See what you did? It worked. You got to me. I was worried. So finally, at the conclusion of this endeavor, Senua learns that she has control of her experience, not the gods, and that she must come to a place of acceptance about Adilian and let him go. It's radical acceptance, Senua. Hela is defeated, and it's kind of implied that Senua is now god status, but I don't know. Still trying to see where it goes with the new one. First piece of Senua's story has a lot to provide to its audience in terms of education and representation. Or it reinforces the very popular sentiment, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.